Russia, in the late 19th century, was a land of stark contrasts. It was a vast empire stretching from Europe to Asia, a land of immense natural beauty and resources. Yet it was also a land of deep social and economic divides. The Russian countryside, with its sprawling fields and quaint villages, painted a picture of pastoral serenity. However, beneath this veneer of tranquility lay a simmering cauldron of discontent. Opulence and grandeur were the hallmarks of the Romanov court, epitomized by the lavish lifestyles of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. The Romanovs lived in palaces adorned with gold and precious stones, hosting extravagant balls and banquets that showcased their immense wealth and power. Their lives were a stark contrast to the harsh realities faced by the majority of the Russian population. Yet, this extravagance stood in stark contrast to the plight of the vast majority. The peasants, who made up the bulk of the population, lived in abject poverty. Their homes were simple, often little more than wooden huts with thatched roofs. They worked the land tirelessly from dawn till dusk, with little to show for their efforts. The disparity between the opulent lives of the elite and the destitute existence of the peasants was glaring. The peasantry, which constituted the bulk of the population, toiled under the yoke of poverty and land scarcity. They were bound to the land, working for landlords who owned vast estates. The peasants' lives were marked by a cycle of relentless labor and meager sustenance. They faced frequent famines, high taxes, and a lack of basic rights. Their plight was a stark reminder of the deep-seated inequalities that plagued Russian society. Their lives were a cycle of relentless labor and meager sustenance, a stark contrast to the excesses of the ruling elite. The Romanovs' extravagant balls and banquets were a world away from the peasants' daily struggle for survival. This stark contrast between the lives of the elite and the common people was a source of growing resentment and anger among the peasantry. The burgeoning industrial centers painted a similarly bleak picture. As Russia began to industrialize, factories sprang up in cities, drawing workers from the countryside. These workers, often former peasants, found themselves in a new kind of servitude. The factories were harsh and unforgiving, with long hours, dangerous conditions, and little pay. The promise of a better life in the city quickly turned into a nightmare for many. Workers endured appalling conditions in factories, laboring long hours for meager wages. The factory floors were crowded and noisy, filled with the clatter of machinery and the cries of overworked laborers. Safety measures were virtually non-existent and injuries were common. The workers' plight was a stark reminder of the human cost of industrial progress. They were afforded little protection, their lives expendable in the relentless drive for industrial output. The factory owners, much like the landlords in the countryside, were primarily concerned with profits. The workers' health and well-being were secondary considerations, if they were considered at all. This disregard for human life further fueled the growing discontent among the working class. The seeds of discontent were sown in these factories, in the squalid living conditions, and in the palpable sense of injustice that permeated the lives of the working class. Workers lived in cramped, unsanitary quarters, often sharing small rooms with multiple families. The sense of injustice was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before this simmering discontent would boil over into open rebellion. The echoes of discontent reverberated through the intellectual circles as well. The intelligentsia, a growing class of educated individuals, began to question the very foundations of the Tsarist autocracy. Universities and salons became hotbeds of political discussion and debate, where ideas of reform and revolution were fervently discussed. The intelligentsia, a growing class of educated individuals, began to question the very foundations of the Tsarist autocracy. They were well-read and well-traveled, drawing inspiration from the political and social movements sweeping across Europe. The desire for change was strong, and the intellectuals played a crucial role in shaping the revolutionary ideas that would soon engulf Russia. They yearned for a more just and equitable society, drawing inspiration from Western liberal and socialist ideologies. The works of thinkers like Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill provided a blueprint for a new society, one based on equality and justice. These ideas resonated deeply with the intelligentsia, who saw in them a way to address the deep-seated inequalities and injustices of Russian society. Names like Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill became increasingly familiar in hushed discussions. Whispers of change carried on the winds of discontent. The intellectuals' debates and discussions laid the groundwork for the revolutionary movements that would soon sweep across Russia, forever changing the course of its history. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov emperors, ascended the throne in 1894, inheriting a realm teeming with unresolved tensions. Born into a world of opulence and privilege, Nicholas was groomed from a young age to uphold the autocratic traditions of his forebears. Yet, despite his regal upbringing, he was ill-prepared for the complexities and challenges of ruling a vast and diverse empire. Steeped in the tradition of autocratic rule, he believed in his divine right to rule, brooking no dissent or opposition. This belief was not merely a personal conviction, but a deeply ingrained aspect of the Romanov dynasty's identity. Nicholas saw himself as the guardian of Russia's destiny, a paternal figure whose authority was both unquestionable and absolute. His reign was marked by a steadfast resistance to reform, clinging to the rigid structures of the past even as the ground beneath him began to shift. The winds of change were blowing across Europe, with new ideas about governance and society taking root. However, Nicholas remained resolute, convinced that any deviation from autocracy would spell disaster for Russia. The Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, became a symbol of his repressive regime. Established to protect the state from internal threats, the Okhrana operated with ruthless efficiency. They infiltrated revolutionary groups, conducted surveillance on suspected dissidents, and employed a network of informants to maintain control. Tasked with silencing dissent, they cast a long shadow over Russian society. The presence of the Okhrana was felt in every corner of the empire, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Ordinary citizens lived in constant anxiety, knowing that a careless word or action could lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Public gatherings were monitored, newspapers censored, and critics of the regime swiftly dealt with, often exiled to the far reaches of the empire. Siberia, with its harsh climate and remote location, became a notorious destination for political exiles. Many who were sent there never returned, their voices silenced forever. Fear and paranoia became pervasive, stifling any hope of peaceful reform. The oppressive atmosphere stunted intellectual and cultural growth, as artists, writers and thinkers were forced to toe the line or face severe consequences. The Tsar's iron grip on power left little room for innovation or progress. The Tsar's resolve was tested in 1905 when a wave of strikes and protests, sparked by the Bloody Sunday massacre, swept through Russia. On that fateful day, peaceful demonstrators seeking better working conditions and political reforms were met with brutal force. The massacre ignited widespread outrage and led to a series of uprisings across the country. The revolution, as it came to be known, forced the Tsar to concede some reforms, including the establishment of a parliament, the Duma. This was a significant moment in Russian history, as it marked the first time that the autocratic regime had to acknowledge the demands of the people. However, the Duma's powers were limited, and Nicholas continued to undermine its authority. However, these concessions proved largely illusory, as the Tsar retained ultimate power and continued to rule with an iron fist. The semblance of reform did little to quell the growing discontent among the populace. Nicholas's reluctance to embrace genuine change only deepened the divisions within Russian society. The 1905 revolution, though ultimately suppressed, had exposed the fragility of the Tsarist regime, revealing the deep well of resentment that simmered beneath the surface. The events of that year were a harbinger of the greater upheavals to come, as the seeds of revolution had been sown and the autocracy's days were numbered. By the eve of World War I, Russia was a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The social fabric, strained by inequalities and injustices, was stretched thin. The political system, ossified and resistant to change, seemed incapable of addressing the needs of the people. The economy, lagging behind its European counterparts, struggled to support the burgeoning population. Economic hardship became a palpable reality for millions of Russians. The cost of essential goods soared, while wages stagnated. Food shortages became commonplace, leading to widespread hunger and desperation. The cities, swelling with migrants from the countryside seeking a better life, found themselves ill-equipped to accommodate the influx, leading to overcrowding and squalor. The Tsarist government, seemingly oblivious to the plight of its people, continued its pursuit of expansionist policies, engaging in costly wars and entangling alliances. The annexation of Port Arthur in 1904 embroiled Russia in a disastrous war with Japan, a conflict that further exposed the weaknesses of the Tsarist regime and sowed the seeds of discontent among the populace. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 proved to be the catalyst that would irrevocably alter the course of Russian history. The war, which began as a conflict between the great powers of Europe, quickly escalated into a global confrontation, drawing in nations from across the world. For Russia, the decision to enter the war was driven by a complex web of alliances, national pride, and a desire to assert its influence on the international stage. Fueled by a potent mix of nationalism and imperial ambition, Russia joined the conflict with patriotic fervor, unaware of the catastrophic consequences that lay ahead. The initial response from the Russian populace was one of overwhelming support. Patriotic posters adorned the streets, and crowds gathered to cheer on the soldiers as they marched off to battle, filled with hope and determination. The war would prove to be a crucible, testing the very foundations of the Tsarist regime and forging the conditions for revolution. The brutal reality of trench warfare soon set in, with soldiers enduring unimaginable hardships on the front lines. The battles were fierce and relentless, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Russian soldiers, ill-prepared for the modern warfare they faced, found themselves in a nightmarish struggle for survival. The initial enthusiasm for war soon gave way to disillusionment as Russia suffered a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Germans. The early victories that had been anticipated never materialized, and the Russian army was forced into a series of retreats. The morale of the troops plummeted, and the once celebrated march to war became a desperate fight to hold the line. The ill-equipped and poorly led Russian army proved no match for the German war machine, resulting in staggering losses on the Eastern Front. The lack of proper equipment, training, and leadership left the Russian soldiers at a severe disadvantage. The casualties mounted, and the grim reality of the war became impossible to ignore. The Eastern Front became a graveyard for countless Russian soldiers, their sacrifices seemingly in vain. The war effort exposed the glaring incompetence and corruption that riddled the Tsarist regime, further eroding public trust. The failures on the battlefield were mirrored by the failures at home, where the government struggled to manage the war effort. Corruption and mismanagement were rampant, and the people began to lose faith in their leaders. The once unquestioned authority of the Tsar was now under intense scrutiny. As the death toll mounted and news of defeats filtered back home, the fragile social order began to unravel. The loss of life was staggering, and the impact was felt in every corner of Russian society. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, and the collective grief turned to anger and frustration. The social fabric of the nation was being torn apart, and the seeds of revolution were being sown. The economy, already strained, buckled under the demands of war. Factories struggled to keep up with the production needs, and the workforce was stretched to its limits. The war effort required vast amounts of resources, and the strain on the economy was immense. The shortages of goods and materials led to a black market where prices soared and corruption thrived. Food shortages intensified, and inflation spiraled out of control, leading to widespread hardship and unrest. The basic necessities of life became scarce, and the people were forced to endure long lines for bread and other essentials. The cost of living skyrocketed, and the gap between the rich and the poor widened. The suffering of the masses became a rallying cry for change. The war had ripped open the festering wounds of Russian society, exposing the rot within and hastening the demise of the Tsarist regime. The discontent that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into open revolt. The revolutionaries, emboldened by the failures of the government, took to the streets, demanding an end to the old order. The Tsarist regime, weakened and discredited, could no longer withstand the tide of change. The crucible of war had forged a new path for Russia, one that would lead to the eventual rise of the Soviet Union.